You know what's funny about avoidant people? They don't lose you when you walk away. They lose you the day they finally want connection, and you're no longer available to give it. Avoidants don't panic when a relationship breaks. They panic when the silence doesn't beg anymore. When the person who always reached out suddenly stops, when your energy isn't orbiting around them anymore, feeding their ego while they pretended they didn't care. For them, distance isn't a response. It's a comfort zone. They don't realize what they had until the space they created starts echoing back at them. That's when the "I never cared" mask breaks. Because the truth is, avoidants don't fear losing people. They fear needing them. And you were that one person they actually needed, but never allowed themselves to admit. So when you finally stop trying, it doesn't just hurt them, it exposes them. It forces them to face the one thing they've been running from their entire life: attachment. Not love, not commitment, but the vulnerability that comes with it. And trust me, that hits harder than heartbreak. Here's the part avoidants never admit. They don't push you away because you're too much. They push you away because you exposed how little they give. Every time you tried to talk, they got cold. Every time you got vulnerable, they shut down. You weren't overwhelming. You were a mirror reflecting their emotional emptiness. And that's a reality they weren't ready to confront. So instead of dealing with connection, they choose distance. Instead of communicating, they disappear. Instead of fixing anything, they pretend nothing happened. That works. Until you finally stop giving them what they take for granted. At first, they convince themselves they're relieved. Life feels lighter without responsibility, without emotional depth, without expectations. But that relief is temporary. The silence that felt freeing slowly starts feeling like abandonment. Not by you, but by their own coping mechanisms. Because when you leave, you're not just gone. You take away the emotional attention they fed on while pretending they didn't need it. And that's when regret begins. Not the soft "I miss you" regret you see in movies. It's the violent internal kind. The regret that shows up when they finally want connection and realize they destroyed the only bridge that ever led to it. They start replaying conversations in their head. They stalk your social media silently. They convince themselves you didn't really leave, you're just cooling off. But when they come back and you're genuinely indifferent, that's the moment their entire avoidance strategy collapses. Because you weren't waiting, you healed. You moved forward. Their regret doesn't come from losing you. It comes from realizing they pushed away someone who would never return in the same way. For the first time, the distance they created isn't protecting them, it's punishing them. They wanted control. They ended up alone. Avoidants don't regret losing love. They regret losing a safe place to hide from themselves. You weren't just a partner. You were the last opportunity they had to grow past their patterns. Now, they have to face themselves without you cushioning the impact. That's the kind of regret that doesn't fade. It follows them into their next relationship, and the next, and the next. They don't miss you because you left. They miss you because you stopped trying. When you finally detach from an avoidant, the shift is silent, not dramatic. They don't feel impact when you leave the door. They feel it when they realize there's no door to return through. Avoidants operate on delayed emotional timelines. They don't process loss when it happens. They process it only when they feel safe from the emotional responsibility of connection. That's why silence hits harder than confrontation. Your absence forces a reflection they never intended to have. They spent months convincing themselves that distancing wasn't a risk. They believe connection can always be resumed because you'd always be waiting. You reinforce that pattern by tolerating mixed signals, excuses, slow replies, emotional shutdowns. You wanted closure, effort, clarity. They wanted relief from emotional obligation. But the moment you stop playing the predictable role, the supporter, the chaser, the emotional caretaker, suddenly they're confronted with the reality that emotional safety was coming from you, not distance. Avoidants don't fear losing people. They fear being emotionally seen. They withdraw thinking distance will calm things down, not realizing distance also removes. The one person who made connection feels safe enough to avoid real vulnerability. Your absence isn't painful because they lost love. It's painful because they lost a buffer between them and emotional reality. The regret cycle starts when they realize replacement isn't possible. Avoidants don't regret losing people instantly because they assume emotional needs are optional. They repress instead of processing. They intellectualize instead of feeling. They move on logically, not emotionally. But once life hits stress, loneliness, failure, crisis, they start craving emotional security. They go back through their past like a catalog, not searching for romance but relief. And when they look for the one who offered emotional grounding, without forcing vulnerability, they notice you're no longer accessible. That's when regret starts not as sadness, but as panic masquerading as nostalgia. They don't miss you first, they miss who they were when they had you. They miss being wanted without effort, being cared for without discomfort, being understood without opening up. But when they return to your energy and find a locked door instead of an open entry point, regret transforms into confusion. Why aren't they there anymore? Why aren't they reacting? Why are they fine without me? Avoidants only realize your value when you're no longer a safe fallback. Your healing becomes their trigger. The most painful part for an avoidant isn't losing access, it's watching you become someone who no longer needs what they withheld. They believed emotional dependence was permanent. They assumed attachment meant permanence. When they see growth, confidence, or peace in your silence, they interpret it as betrayal because in their mind, you were supposed to stay stuck. Your transformation forces a comparison. They stayed emotionally stagnant. You evolved past who they met. That comparison highlights a truth they avoided. They didn't push you away because you were too much. They pushed you away because intimacy demanded more emotional accountability than they were ready to give. Now your growth invalidates the narrative they used to justify distance. They told themselves, this connection is overwhelming. Your growth proves. No, the problem was your inability to show up. That's where regret becomes shame. Why they return late, but with no real change? Avoidants often return with warm nostalgia, half-effort emotional crumbs, sudden curiosity, random check-ins, but rarely with accountability. They don't return to rebuild. They return to relieve discomfort. They want reassurance they're not forgotten, that the connection still exists without them having to maintain it. Their return isn't commitment, it's emotional maintenance. You're not being chosen, you're being bookmarked. If you respond, they'll relax. If you ignore, they'll panic. But neither response guarantees change, because regret doesn't equal growth. Regret is emotional discomfort. Growth requires confronting internal patterns, trauma, and fear of intimacy, and most won't do that unless they lose something permanently. The real test isn't whether they come back, it's whether they can stay without retreating the moment emotional closeness returns. Your power is in not repeating the dynamic. Walking away isn't just distance, it's a boundary backed by evolution. If you leave but remain emotionally available, the cycle continues. Avoidants only evolve when the loss is irreversible, enough to force internal confrontation. That doesn't mean ignoring them out of spite. It means redefining your emotional value system so you're no longer attracted to emotional starvation disguised as independence. Your power move isn't silence. It's no longer needing validation from someone who couldn't handle closeness. You stop being the rescue, the safety net, the emotional translator. You stop giving energy to people who weaponize distance to feel in control. Instead, you align with people who offer emotional presence without being threatened by intimacy. That's when the regret becomes real, not just nostalgic discomfort, but the full realization they didn't lose someone who needed them. They lost someone who grew past them. And that's a type of regret that doesn't fade.